When Mia Vale stepped into Lucas DeLuca's penthouse, the room seemed to hold its breath before she did. The chandelier above the glass atrium threw soft gold across polished marble floors, across the dark piano in the corner, across the man standing beside the window in a charcoal suit so sharp it looked cut from shadow itself. He was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller without raising his voice. Lucas turned slowly, his gaze landing on Mia's face for only a second before she looked away, one hand rising almost instinctively to the edge of the silk scarf wrapped high around her cheeks and mouth. "If you're going to stare," she said, her voice calm but thin with strain, "at least be polite about it." Lucas's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. He had expected nerves, maybe even fear, from the woman his attorney had described as quiet, capable, and stubborn enough to demand this meeting on her own terms. He had not expected mystery. Mia stood straight despite the tension in her shoulders, a small leather portfolio pressed to her chest, her gloves neatly fitted, her scarf immaculate, as if she had spent extra time making sure no one would see too much of her. "You said you had information about the Bellini account," Lucas said. His voice was low, measured, almost detached. "I did." She set the portfolio on the table between them, but did not sit. "And I said I'd only speak to you in person. That sounds like a threat." "No." Her eyes lifted, steady and unreadable. "That sounds like a warning." For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the city glowed in the late afternoon like a field of distant lights, but inside the penthouse the silence felt heavier than sound. Lucas had built his life on reading people quickly, on spotting weakness before it could become a problem, yet nothing about Mia read clearly. Her posture was too controlled for someone desperate, her tone too composed for someone seeking favor. And then there was the scarf. Always the scarf. She touched it once when she spoke, not with vanity but with caution, like a hand over a wound no one else was allowed to see. Lucas noticed. Of course he noticed. "What happened to your face?" he asked, the question leaving him before he could soften it. Mia's hand froze at her cheek. For a split second, the composure he had been studying flickered. Not anger, not embarrassment, something older, heavier. "That," she said quietly, "is not why I came." Lucas did not look away. "It's hard to ignore." "Good." The word landed between them like a closed door. She reached for the portfolio again and opened it, revealing photographs, dates, and copied ledger pages tied together with neat black clips. "Your family's shipping division moved funds through Bellini Construction 3 years ago. The trail was hidden well, but not well enough." Lucas's jaw tightened, his attention dropping to the documents despite himself. Bellini. The name carried a history that had long since been buried under polished business reports and old obligations. Mia watched him carefully, as if she knew exactly which thread to pull. "I didn't come here to embarrass you," she said. "I came because someone is about to use this against you unless you know the truth first." Lucas lifted his eyes to hers again, and this time he really looked at her. Not just the scarf, not just the gloves. Her stillness, her control, the faint tremor in her fingers when she turned a page, the deliberate way she kept her face angled away from the light. "Who are you?" he asked. Mia's breath caught, just barely. "Someone who survived what your world left behind." And in that instant, Lucas understood that the secret she was hiding was not cosmetic, not pride, not a game. It was history. It was pain. It was connected to him. Lucas did not answer right away. The name Bellini seemed to hang in the air between them, quiet and heavy, like a locked door someone had just found the key to. He set the documents down on the edge of the desk, then leaned back with the kind of stillness that only came from a man trying not to reveal that something inside him had already moved. Mia remained where she was, hands folded carefully in front of her, her posture composed enough to pass for calm, if not for the faint tension in her shoulders. Outside the glass walls of the office, the city kept shining in the afternoon light, all steel and chrome and polished ambition, but inside the room the atmosphere had changed. Lucas had entered expecting a legal warning, maybe a demand, maybe another problem attached to one of his oldest family names. Instead, he was staring at a woman who spoke about his world as if she had once belonged to its hidden rooms and then been pushed out into the cold. "How long have you known about this?" he asked at last, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharpness he used with everyone else. Mia's gaze flickered to the side for a second, toward the framed awards on the shelf, The view of the city beyond the window, anything but his face. Long enough to know your name is still useful to people who don't deserve it, she said quietly. Lucas's jaw tightened. That answer told him more than he wanted to hear. It meant this was not a coincidence, not a stranger's warning, not some harmless curiosity. It meant someone had been watching him, waiting for a moment when the past could be dragged into the light. He took one slow breath and asked the question that had already begun to change the shape of the room. What exactly are they planning to use against me? Mia did not speak at once. Her silence was deliberate, measured, almost painful to watch. When she finally opened the folder again, she turned a page with 2 fingers, as if even the paper itself might betray her if handled too quickly. A name, she said. A record. And a photograph that was never supposed to survive. Lucas stared at her. The words struck something buried deep, something old enough to be nearly forgotten, but not old enough to be dead. A photograph. A record. His mind moved without permission, reaching backward into years he had spent making sure certain files were sealed, certain people were paid, and certain stories never crossed a desk like this one. Yet Mia was not offering rumor. She was offering proof. He stepped closer, not enough to threaten her, just enough to see the strain in the line of her mouth. Whose photograph? He asked. Mia lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time her composure cracked just slightly, like glass holding under pressure. Yours, she said. The words settled into the room with the force of a verdict. Lucas felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled pull. He had spent years building a life that looked untouchable from the outside, a life of power, reputation, and distance. But in one instant, with one quiet answer, Mia had reminded him that the past did not disappear just because a man learned how to bury it. It waited. It watched. And sometimes it came back wearing a calm voice and careful hands. Let me see it, he said. Mia hesitated, then reached into the folder and slid out a single envelope, yellowed at the edges, the kind of thing that had survived too many years in too many hidden places. Lucas took it, and the moment his fingers touched it, something cold moved through him. On the front, in faded ink, was a date he recognized immediately. The same year his life had split in two. He looked up at Mia again, and now there was no mistaking the truth in her expression. She had not come here to warn him about the past. She had come because the past had found her first. And somewhere inside that sealed envelope was the first real reason why. Before they could speak, Mia carefully tipped the envelope open and removed a single folded page, its paper soft with age and handled too many times to be innocent. Lucas watched her fingers with a strange stillness, as if the room had narrowed to the space between that page and the truth it carried. When she unfolded it, both of them saw the same name at the top, written in a familiar slanted hand. Eleanor Wren. Lucas went rigid. It was the name of the woman who had raised him after everything else had been taken. Mia's eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw not triumph, but sorrow, as though she had been carrying this burden long before she ever stood in his office. She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom, where a line had been underlined in fading blue ink. It described a private agreement, one signed years ago, meant to stay hidden forever. Lucas read it once, then again, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop with every word. The document did not accuse anyone outright, but it named a shipment, a date, and a witness who had never been questioned. A witness whose initials matched Mia's father. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the kind of dread that only comes when a man realizes the past has been waiting in the dark with perfect patience. Mia took a slow breath and, with visible hesitation, turned the page over. On the back was a second note, written in newer ink, far sharper than the rest. It was not from the past. It was from someone alive. Lucas's eyes moved over the first line, and his expression changed so quickly Mia almost stepped back. Because the note did not just confirm the agreement. It gave a location, an address only a few miles from where they were standing, and beneath it, a time written for that same night. The room went quiet around them, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel too loud. Mia swallowed and said she had found the envelope tucked inside her mother's old sewing box after the funeral, hidden beneath a lining no one had bothered to lift in years. Lucas stared at the page as if it might rearrange itself into something less dangerous, something that did not carry his family's name in the margins of a secret he had spent a lifetime trying not to remember. Then his phone lit up in his hand with a message from an unknown number. If Mia showed you the envelope, do not come alone. He looked at her again, and for the first time since she had entered his office, he understood that she had not simply brought him a memory. She had brought him the doorway to a betrayal still in motion, and now the next name on that paper was about to change everything. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Mia and Lucas. The message on Lucas's phone had vanished as quickly as it appeared, but its warning stayed in the air between them like frost. Mia stood very still, one hand curled around the edge of her chair, while Lucas slowly folded the old page and set it beside the envelope as if sudden movement might wake whatever was hiding inside it. His office looked even colder now, all dark wood, glass, and midnight reflections, the city lights beyond the windows turning the room into a polished shadow. Mia tried to steady her breathing. She had spent years believing her mother's silence meant the past was buried. Now she was beginning to understand that the silence had only been rented. Lucas asked her to tell him everything again, every detail, every name, every place her mother had hidden the box, and as Mia spoke, he listened with the kind of focus that made his usually unreadable face look almost vulnerable. She told him about the seam in the sewing box lining, the brittle cloth, the way her mother's hands had shaken when she sewed that lining shut years ago, as if she were locking away a storm. Lucas's jaw tightened. He recognized the handwriting on the paper now, not because it belonged to his mother, but because it belonged to someone who had once worked closely enough with his family to know where the body was buried, so to speak, without ever needing to say it aloud. Mia's voice softened when she reached the part she had dreaded most, the line of names written beneath the folded page, names she had not understood until tonight. One of them belonged to a man who had sat at Lucas's family table for holiday dinners. Another belonged to a woman who still sent Christmas cards. Lucas turned away from her for a moment and looked out at the city, one hand braced on the windowsill, and when he spoke again his voice had gone low and measured. This was not a forgotten secret. It was a living one. He asked Mia if anyone else knew she had brought the envelope to him. She shook her head. No one. Not her aunt. Not her landlord. Not even the woman at the diner who had watched her leave early with the box pressed to her chest like an apology. Lucas nodded once, then opened his desk drawer and removed a plain black phone he did not use for ordinary calls. He typed a number from memory, paused, and then stopped before pressing send. Something in Mia's face must have changed, because he looked at her and said quietly that if the warning was real, then whoever sent it already knew the envelope had resurfaced. Mia felt the blood drain from her face. Lucas crossed the room and lowered his voice even more, as if the walls themselves might be listening. He told her that after his father died, a handful of people had moved through the family business with too much ease and too much interest, and he had spent years trying to prove which smiles had been rehearsed. Mia's throat tightened. The envelope was not just her mother's secret anymore. It had become a test of trust, and maybe a trap. Lucas slid the page back toward her and said the next step was not to go home, not tonight. He was going to call someone he trusted, someone who could verify the names without alerting the wrong people. And Mia realized that for the first time since she had found the sewing box, the danger was no longer hidden in the past. It was already in the room, and it had just learned her name. Before the room could settle back into its uneasy silence, Lucas was already on the phone in the adjoining study, his voice low and measured, while Mia stood near the desk with the envelope pressed against her ribs like it might keep her steady. The old house felt different now, as if every polished surface had remembered something it was trying to hide. When Lucas returned, his expression had hardened into that careful calm he wore when the truth was close enough to touch. He told Mia that the names inside the envelope were not random at all. They matched a private record kept by his father years ago, a list of shipments, signatures, and donations that had moved through the family business long before Lucas took over. Mia went cold. Her mother had not simply left behind a secret. She had left behind evidence. Lucas took the page from her, scanned the handwriting again, and then looked up with a quiet intensity that made Mia's pulse quicken. One of the names on that list belonged to a woman who had managed the company's foundation for nearly a decade, someone trusted by everyone, someone who had smiled at board meetings and charity galas as if she had nothing to fear. Lucas said he had asked his contact to verify the records, And there was one more thing he needed Mia to see. He led her down the hall to a locked cabinet in his father's study, opened it with a key that had not been used in years, and removed a thin leather folder bound with a faded ribbon. Inside was a photograph, brittle at the edges, showing Mia's mother standing beside Lucas's father in front of a church she barely recognized. Her mother was younger, but the expression on her face was unmistakable, guarded and determined, as if she had agreed to keep a promise no one else was allowed to know. Mia stared at the picture, her breath catching as Lucas quietly said that his father had not been the only one protecting a secret. There had been letters, too, and one of them mentioned Mia by name. Lucas had not opened it yet. He set the sealed envelope on the desk between them and said that if Mia wanted the truth, they would read it together, but once they did, there would be no going back. And as Mia reached for the paper, she realized the secret in her hands was not only about the past, but about why her mother had crossed paths with the Castellano family at all. Mia's fingers hovered over the envelope as if the paper itself could burn, and Lucas watched her with that same careful stillness he had worn all evening, like a man standing guard over a wound he had not caused but still felt responsible for. The room was so quiet she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall, each second pressing against her chest. At last, she broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter, yellowed with age, the ink softened by time, but still legible enough to make her pulse stumble. It began with her mother's name, then moved quickly into words that made Mia's breath go thin. A promise, a separation, and a child who had been kept hidden for her own safety. Lucas's jaw tightened as he read over her shoulder, his hand braced on the desk, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. The letter did not read like a confession. It read like a decision made under pressure, a choice between two families, two loyalties, and one truth that had been buried to protect a little girl who had never known she was being protected. Mia looked up slowly, her eyes glossy, and Lucas said nothing at first, because the worst part was not the secret itself, but the name written in the margin beside hers, a name connected to his own father in a way that changed everything they had thought they knew. She turned the page and found a second note tucked behind it, smaller, softer, and written in her mother's hand after years of silence. It said that if Mia ever came asking, she should be told the truth about the house on the lake and the man who used to wait there every Sunday. Mia's throat tightened. The lake house was not just a memory from childhood stories anymore. It was a place, a meeting point, a place her mother had hidden from her because it belonged to the Castellanos, and because one of them had once promised to keep Mia safe if the truth ever came to light. Lucas reached for the second note, his expression changing as he recognized the date at the bottom. He had seen that date before, in his father's private files, attached to a transfer of guardianship no one in the family had ever explained. His voice was low when he finally spoke, almost reverent. This wasn't just a love letter, he said. It was a warning. Mia stared at him, frozen between fear and a strange, aching hope, as if every answer in the room had just become one question deeper. Lucas's hand moved to the envelope again, and this time he pulled out a key wrapped in tissue, old brass darkened by years of being hidden. Taped to it was a label with one address, handwritten in the same careful script as her mother's note. Mia read it once, then again, and Lucas went very still, because the address was not for an office, or a storage unit, or even the lake house. It was for a private room at the Castellano estate that had been sealed for decades, waiting for the one person who had been meant to open it. Lucas didn't speak for several seconds. He stood in the dim hallway of the Castellano estate, the old brass key resting in his palm like something sacred, while Mia watched his face change in tiny, careful ways, as if each new detail was forcing open a locked room inside him. The address on the label meant nothing to the world, but everything to someone who had lived long enough with secrets. It pointed to the east wing, beyond the formal dining rooms and polished marble corridors, past the family gallery and the locked cedar doors no guest had ever been allowed to approach. Mia could feel her pulse in her throat. She had spent her whole life learning how to expect disappointment, yet this house kept offering her one quiet shock after another, each one gentler than the last, and somehow harder to bear. Lucas looked at the key again, then at her. "My father never mentioned this room," he said. "Not once." His voice was calm, but there was a tightness under it now, a thread of old confusion pulling at the edges. Mia folded her hands so he would not see them shake. My mother never mentioned it either, she answered, her words barely more than breath. But she knew it existed. She must have. Lucas nodded once, as if that mattered more than he wanted to admit. He slipped the key into his jacket pocket, then turned and led her deeper into the estate, his footsteps muted on the thick runner carpet, her own quieter still on the edge of fear. The hallway narrowed as they approached the east wing, and the air seemed to change there, cooler, older, touched by the faint scent of dust and cedar oil. A pair of sconces glowed low against the walls, casting amber light over framed photographs that no one seemed to notice anymore. Generations of Castellanos looking outward with the same severe eyes, the same carefully controlled expressions. At the end of the corridor stood a door painted the same deep green as winter pine, its brass handle untouched, its frame so still it seemed less like an entrance than a secret preserved by time. Lucas stopped before it. Mia did too. He reached into his pocket, took out the key, and held it there for a moment without moving, as if waiting for the room behind the door to decide whether it would finally tell the truth. Then he slid the key into the lock. The sound it made was small, but it carried through the hallway like a confession. The door opened on a breath of stale air and shadow. Inside was a private room lined with shelves, each one holding objects wrapped in linen, folders tied with faded ribbon, and one large cabinet sealed with a metal latch. Mia stepped in slowly, her eyes adjusting to the half-light, and then she saw the thing that made her stop cold. On the wall above the cabinet, pinned carefully beneath a yellowing frame, was a photograph of a young woman with the same eyes Mia had seen in the mirror her entire life. Lucas came up beside her and looked at it, his expression unreadable. Beneath the photograph, in neat handwriting, was a single line, "For the daughter who was never meant to be forgotten." Mia's breath caught. Her mother's handwriting, or something so close to it that the difference no longer mattered. Lucas moved closer to the cabinet, and when he lifted the latch, the metal gave way with a soft click that felt far too loud in the silence. Inside lay a stack of sealed envelopes, a ledger, and a folded document marked with the same address. At the very top was a name Mia had never seen before, written in bold ink, followed by one sentence that made her knees weaken. Lucas read it first, and for the first time since she had known him, all the color drained from his face. "This room," he whispered, staring at the page, "was meant to reveal who you really are." Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Mia and Lucas. The room seemed to shrink around the page in Lucas's hand, as though the air itself had turned to glass. Mia stood still, her fingers pressed to the edge of the cabinet, unable to speak as the words settled deeper into her chest. This was no longer a question of curiosity or coincidence. It was a question of identity, of blood, of a life hidden so carefully that even the furniture in this room seemed to have been waiting to confess. Lucas lowered the document slowly and looked at Mia with a kind of caution she had never seen in him before, not coldness, but something far more dangerous, certainty. "This isn't just a record," he said, his voice quiet enough to feel like a secret. "It's proof." Mia swallowed hard. The ledger was open now, its pages filled with names, dates, and handwritten notes that crossed and recrossed each other like a map only one person had ever learned to read. Some entries were marked in red, others underlined twice, and every page seemed to point to the same impossible conclusion. Her mother had not simply been connected to this house. She had known it. She had protected something here, or someone. Mia reached for the folded document, but Lucas stopped her with a slight movement of his hand. Not to forbid her, only to steady her. The gesture was so careful, so unexpectedly gentle, that her breath caught. He unfolded the paper himself, and both of them stared at the paragraph printed near the bottom. It named a trust, a sealed inheritance, and a condition tied to a person whose legal identity had been concealed for decades. Mia's eyes moved over the lines again and again, but one phrase refused to blur. "Rightful heir." Her throat tightened. "That can't be me," she whispered, though the room had already begun to answer her. Lucas did not speak right away. Instead, he turned back to the ledger, scanning names that seemed to connect old addresses, private accounts, and a pattern of visits that had ended the same year her mother disappeared from public records. His jaw tightened as he read, and then he found another page, tucked between two envelopes, with a photograph clipped to it. It showed a woman standing at the steps of this same house, younger than Mia had ever known her, with the same eyes, the same careful posture, and the unmistakable expression of someone holding back a truth too large to say aloud. Mia covered her mouth. The resemblance was not suggestion anymore. It was inheritance. Lucas looked from the photo to Mia, and something in his face shifted completely, as if the final piece had fallen into place. "Your mother didn't leave you nothing," he said. "She left you a place in a story someone tried to erase." Mia's knees felt weak, but she forced herself closer to the table. Among the envelopes was one addressed to her in the same elegant hand, sealed and untouched. Her name was written with such precision that it seemed impossible it had survived all these years without being opened. Lucas picked it up, then paused, studying the seal as though he already understood how fragile the next moment would be. For the first time, he glanced at her not like a man guarding a secret, but like someone standing beside her at the edge of something irreversible. "This one," he said softly, "is meant for you." Mia took the envelope with both hands, the paper strangely warm, and just as she turned it over, a hidden key slid free from the flap and landed in her palm with a small metallic sound that made both of them freeze. On the back of the envelope, written in her mother's hand, were 4 words that made Mia's heart stop. "Go to the attic." Mia did not move for a moment. The attic door at the top of the narrow staircase had not been opened in years, and the silence around her felt almost sacred, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for this exact second. Lucas stood behind her at a respectful distance, his hand near the railing but not touching, giving her the space to decide whether she wanted the truth or feared it too much to continue. Mia lifted the key, staring at its old brass teeth, then looked up at him with eyes that were wet but steady. "My mother wanted me to come here," she whispered. Lucas nodded once. "Then let's see what she left behind." The attic smelled of cedar, dust, and time. A single string bulb swung softly overhead, throwing a warm circle of light across stacked trunks, folded winter blankets, and a small dresser covered in a white sheet that had long ago faded to the color of bones. Mia moved slowly, as if every object might speak if she disturbed it too quickly. Her fingers trembled when she found the old lock on a weathered chest tucked beneath the eaves. The key fit perfectly. The latch gave way with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. Inside was not money, not jewelry, not anything that would have explained all the secrecy. There were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon, each one addressed to Mia in her mother's careful hand. Some were dated the year her mother had fallen ill. Some were written after Mia had left for college. Some were never sent at all. Mia sank to her knees on the attic floor, the envelopes spreading across her lap like pieces of a life she had never been allowed to see. Lucas crouched beside her, reading only the first line of the top page before stopping, his jaw tightening with an emotion he did not try to hide. The letter was not only an apology. It was a confession of love, of sacrifice, of a mother who had carried her daughter through every hard year without allowing her to see how much she had given up. Mia read in silence, her tears falling onto the paper as she learned that the woman she thought had kept too many secrets had in fact been protecting her from a truth too heavy for a child to carry. Years ago, her mother had known the family fortune came with enemies, greed, and people who would use a child's name as leverage. She had chosen distance, lies, and a quiet life in order to keep Mia safe. Lucas watched Mia's face change as the pages turned. The grief did not vanish, but it softened into something larger, something steadier. Understanding. She was not abandoned. She had been shielded. When she reached the final letter, her breath caught. It explained the key, the attic, and the reason Lucas had been given a place in all of this. Her mother had trusted him long before Mia had ever met him, believing that the man who could still tenderness under power would know how to protect what remained. Mia slowly looked up at Lucas, and for the first time since the beginning of all their confusion, she saw him clearly not as the imposing man who had entered her life like a storm, but as someone who had quietly chosen care over control. "You knew," she said, her voice breaking just enough to reveal the hurt beneath it. Lucas shook his head. "I knew pieces. Not all of it." He reached into the chest and found one last envelope. Your mother asked me to wait until you were ready. Mia opened it and found a photograph of herself at 7 years old, standing in a kitchen too small for the future that waited beyond it. Her mother behind her with both hands on her shoulders, smiling with the tired pride of a woman who had given everything she had. On the back were 3 words that made Mia press the photo to her chest. She was enough. Lucas watched her shoulders shake, then spoke with a gentleness that made the room feel warmer. She was right. Mia turned toward him, and in that attic full of dust and memory, something unspoken passed between them that was no longer fear and no longer pity. It was recognition. He had not come into her life to own her story. He had come to help her carry it. She rose slowly, still holding the letters, and Lucas stood with her. Neither of them needed to say what had changed. The air had changed. The house had changed. And Mia, who had spent so long believing that love had to be earned through silence and survival, finally understood that she had been loved fiercely all along. When they stepped back down the staircase together, the evening light spilling through the hallway windows turned the old walls gold. And for the first time in years, the home did not feel like a place of hiding. It felt like a place of return. And that night, with the truth finally in her hands, Mia learned that the deepest love is sometimes the one that waits patiently in the dark until you are strong enough to see it.